The most important difficulty between the Catholics and the Orthodox is the question of the basis, the significance, and the practical exercise of the universal primacy of the Bishop of Rome. In his encyclical letter, Ut Unum Sin, Pope John Paul II has invited the Orthodox, and indeed all Christians, to join him in exploring this primacy and considering how it may best be exercised so as to build up the unity of the Church rather than being a stumbling block to that unity. The year 1204, when the Fourth Crusade seized Constantinople and enthroned a Latin patriarch, is a symbolic moment of a spiritual break between the Church of Rome and the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople. Eventually, almost all the Byzantine East stood with Constantinople and either broke communion with Rome or lost that communion inadvertently, as it were. Despite sporadic efforts to present an Orthodox ecclesiology with no universal primacy at all, the practicality of life demanded some form of central authority. In theory and in practice, these surrogates for the Roman primacy developed at various times. The first, the emperor at Constantinople. Perhaps the emperor was the most successful surrogate. The Roman emperor, and to the very last, to that terrible 29th of May, 1453, when Blessed Constantine XII died defending the walls of Constantinople, the emperor at Constantinople always remained the Roman emperor, held his position by a succession of the same vintage as the papacy. For centuries, the emperor had confirmed papal elections. The emperor had summoned and sponsored the 7 ecumenical councils. So long as the emperor was Orthodox in faith, even the popes recognized that he enjoyed great, though not precisely defined, legal authority in matters which later generations would consider purely ecclesiastical. However, despite strenuous efforts, the Roman emperors never succeeded in imposing their own would-be dogmas on the Church. Frequently, people who were unfamiliar with the history of the Christian Roman Empire accused the Church of allowing the emperors to dictate the doctrines of the faith. The ghost of Arius would find that bitterly amusing, and so would other famous heretics who sometimes gained the imperial eagles only to discover that while the Church was often subservient to the emperor in administrative matters, when it came to the Orthodox faith, the witness of the martyrs and the monks invariably triumphed. Each time we review the history of such imperial efforts to impose some heresy on the Church, we are unable to close our eyes to the role of the popes of Rome in defending the Orthodox faith against the Arians, against the Monophysites, against the Monothelites, against the Iconoclasts, and so on. As a surrogate primate of the Church, the Roman emperor had, shall we say, a long reign, if I may be forgiven a play on words. As late as the end of the 14th century, when the actual territory of the empire was reduced to Constantinople itself, a few surrounding villages and some holdings in the Moray, and the emperor was a vassal of the Sultan, the Orthodox believed that the Roman emperor was the king whom St. Paul commands us to honor, and the emperor's name was commemorated in the Divine Liturgy by all the Orthodox, wherever they might be. Nevertheless, all worldly empires eventually come to an end. The 29th of May is still a day of sorrow for the Orthodox, but the Roman emperor is not coming back. Number 2, the Sultan. After the fall of Constantinople, the Sultan considered himself the heir of the Roman emperor and made every effort to act the part with regard to the Orthodox Church. Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, appointed the new Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Sultan's successor retained the power of appointment and deposition of the ecumenical patriarch and other church officials, even in the early 20th century. Nobody ever attempted to justify this theologically, but since the Ottoman Empire came to include a large share of Orthodox territories from the 15th to the 19th centuries, the force of custom combined with state power gave the Sultan a power in Orthodox administrative matters that had to be reckoned with. The Sultan was, of course, not a Christian, and very few sultans had any direct interest in Christian doctrines. I'm not aware of any effort by any sultan to interfere in Orthodox dogmas. The sultans were anxious to use the Orthodox Church to assist in controlling the Orthodox population of the Ottoman Empire, and the sultans were careful to impede any contacts between the Orthodox Church and the Pope of Rome. The sultans were always willing to use the Orthodox Church as what modern businessmen call a cash cow, a source of ready money. For these reasons, the sultans sought to prevent divisions within the Orthodox Church. Such divisions would have provided a rallying point against Ottoman domination of the Orthodox Church. As a result, internal Orthodox divisions in and around the Ottoman Empire only manifested themselves in the 19th century, as one after another Orthodox countries gained civil liberation from the sultans and demanded ecclesiastical independence as well, autocephaly, as it is termed in Orthodox ecclesiology. The ecumenical patriarchs tried strongly to resist these demands for autocephaly, but one after another, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and even Greece obtained recognition as autocephalous churches. Few Orthodox realized it at the time, but this development was to bear bitter fruit for the Orthodox Church in the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire came to an end, and the Sultan could no longer provide any sort of primacy for the Orthodox Church. The Sultan and his family have vanished from history, and no Orthodox are interested in restoring them. Number 3, the Tsar of Russia. After the fall of Constantinople, the Russian Tsar Ivan III married a Byzantine princess, and soon the Tsars of Moscow developed the ambition to become the new universal Christian emperor on the model of the Roman emperor. The attempt never succeeded. Unlike the Roman emperor, the Tsar was closely bound with a particular culture and with the particular national Russian agenda. Moreover, the Tsar lost his credibility with many Orthodox by abolishing the Moscow Patriarchate in 1720 and replacing it with a holy governing synod, which was a blatant instrument for government control of the church. Number 4, the commissars. The communists, of course, were not Christians. As militant anti-theists, their main goal was to abolish religion. But they did not want to control the Orthodox Church, and after World War II, they made serious efforts to extend that control beyond the geographic limits of Soviet power. But they did want to control the Orthodox Church, and after World War II, they made serious efforts to extend that control beyond the geographic limits of Soviet power. Measured against the 2,000 years of Christian history, the communist attempt did not last long, only a few decades, and there is certainly no one who would suggest reviving communist control of the church now. Number 5, the Patriarch of Moscow. From its establishment in 1590, the Moscow Patriarchate has more or less openly sought to replace Rome as the first episcopal see. There has never been an ecclesiological basis for this claim, but since the Russian Church has the largest number of Orthodox faithful, and since the Moscow Patriarchate has been allied to the large and powerful Russian state, Moscow has sometimes been able to impose her will on other local Orthodox churches. The patriarchs of Moscow have used this power in the direct interest of the Russian state and often against the actual interest of other local churches. As a result, almost nobody in the Orthodox world, apart from the Moscow Patriarch itself, would support Moscow's primatial pretensions. Number 6, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. As the Bishop of New Rome, the imperial capital of the Roman Emperor, the city which for centuries was far and away the most important city in the Christian world, the Ecumenical Patriarch came to acquire enormous influence in the life of the Orthodox Church. For long periods of time, during the Crusades and later during the Muslim conquest, the Orthodox Patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem became resident prelates at the patriarchal court in Constantinople. And the Ecumenical Patriarch could even appoint candidates to be patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. During the heyday of the Ottoman Empire, the Ecumenical Patriarchate increased the territory where it exercised effective jurisdiction, controlling the Orthodox in Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. But two flaws in the attempted universal primacy of the Ecumenical Patriarchate slowly emerged. First, and more important, this primacy rested almost exclusively on the principle of accommodation, the notion that ecclesiastical structures follow civil structures. Historically, the principle of accommodation has its place in the canonical tradition. It is normal that an important diocesan center should be an important city. But even Constantinople itself has always realized that this basis is too weak for a universal primacy and has tried to develop a more convincing ecclesiological basis for Constantinople's claim. As sometimes articulated, that claim would rest on the theory that as the Bishop of Rome does not exercise his primacy within the Orthodox Pentarchy, the second of the Pentarchy derives the right to exercise the functions which should belong to the Bishop of Rome. However, very few Orthodox, other than those who actually belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, are prepared to concede such an authority to the Phanar in any practical way. Much of the reason for this unwillingness to recognize such a function in the Phanar has to do with the second flaw in Constantinople's primacy, the close alliance of the Phanar with the Greek national aspirations, often against the interests of other Orthodox. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople is still the ethnarch of the Greeks and exercises serious authority over the Orthodox Greek diaspora around the world. Occasionally, the Ecumenical Patriarch is successful in mediating problems elsewhere in the Orthodox world. But this only succeeds when the contending parties agree voluntarily to accept the mediation of Constantinople, and that acceptance is relatively rare. As the 20th century draws to a close, the continued presence of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople is seriously endangered, because the number of Orthodox Greeks remaining in the city is rapidly dwindling to the vanishing point. Only Turkish citizens may hold office in the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, and every year it becomes more difficult to find suitable candidates. Ironically, one of the strongest supports of the Ecumenical Patriarchate is the papacy, which continues to lend its moral pressure to the efforts to maintain the Phanar in Istanbul. In the aftermath of World War I, two catastrophes hit the Orthodox Church one after the other: the Russian Revolution, which brought the communists to power, and the Greek-Turkish War, which resulted in the expulsion of most of the Orthodox from Turkey. Either of these would have shaken the Orthodox equilibrium. The combination, however, has produced an enduring crisis in Orthodox ecclesiology and a seemingly endless inability for the Orthodox to act unequivocally. Orthodox opposed to the Roman primacy tried to excuse the Orthodox chaos of the 20th century by blaming it on the communists. But the communists are gone for nearly a decade, and the situation is becoming worse rather than better. Besides the collapse of the Greek community in Turkey and the persecution of the Orthodox in the communist countries, another factor has increased the sense of urgency. the inability of the Orthodox Church to give either a theoretical or a concrete solution to the problem of the Orthodox diaspora. Eastern Orthodoxy in the United States is made up of about 20 jurisdictions, all existing in the same territory and asserting jurisdiction on various bases. In terms of either canon law or sound ecclesiology, this is ludicrous. The principle of the unity of the episcopate based on the presence of one bishop in one city is fundamental. Everyone agrees with this principle, and no one is able to make this principle effective. To make matters infinitely worse, these jurisdictions do not all maintain Eucharistic communion with one another. For the Orthodox Church, which proudly announces her Eucharistic ecclesiology, such a situation is unbearable. Throughout the 20th century, the long dormant issue of universal primacy has been confronting the Eastern Orthodox Church. Nearly 40 years ago, Father Alexander Schmemann wrote that, quote, "Neither can we quote here all the testimonies of the fathers and councils unanimously acknowledging Rome as the senior church and the center of ecumenical agreement. It is only for the sake of biased polemics that one can ignore these testimonies, their consensus and significance. It has happened, however, that if Roman historians and theologians have always interpreted this evidence in juridical terms, thus falsifying its real meaning, their Orthodox opponents have systematically belittled the evidence itself. Orthodox theology is still waiting a truly Orthodox evaluation of universal primacy in the first millennium of church history, an evaluation free from polemical or apologetic exaggerations. Such study will certainly reveal that the essence and purpose of this primacy is to express and preserve the unity of the church in faith and life, to express and preserve the unity of all churches, to keep them from isolating themselves into ecclesiastical provincialism, losing the Catholic ties, separating themselves from the unity of life. It means ultimately to assume the care, the solicitude of the churches so that each one of them can abide in that fruitfulness which is always the whole Catholic tradition and not any part of it." End quote. In 1971, the Patriarchate of Moscow gave autocephaly to one of the Russian Orthodox factions in the United States. This group then renamed themselves the Orthodox Church in America and asserted its claim to be the local Orthodox Church in this country, even though an absolute majority of the Orthodox faithful and the Orthodox parishes in this country had never belonged to it, and most of the Orthodox local churches in the traditional Orthodox countries did not and do not recognize this autocephaly. For Orthodox ecclesiologists, the resulting confusion is not merely unbearable, it is unthinkable. But there is no end in sight. In 1976, Father John Meindorf, professor and later dean of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, observed that the church needs, quote, "institutional forms that would be a guarantee and a true expression of the church's universal dimension. 3 levels are always necessary, and each must always penetrate the other in a reciprocal way if the church is to take form in all its fullness. The first level, the local church, is true church in the celebration of the Eucharist. So the church must also implicate and take form in the regional division, cultural, national, social. But in the end, the church must also take form in the universal dimension. Regionalism must also always be reconciled with universalism. This is the only way that we can be within the church that was willed by the Lord, and together we must all try to discover how these 3 dimensions can be reconciled." The question continues to become increasingly urgent. In 1978, Professor John Erickson of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary wrote that, quote, internal needs have compelled the Orthodox to examine the meaning of primacy in the Church, and more concretely, the role of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. In the 19th century, Orthodox responses to Vatican I could argue that the system of autocephalous churches, utterly independent yet united in faith, was an alternative to papalism. The weaknesses of this argument have become increasingly apparent. Like the pre-World War I system of sovereign nation states, on which in many respects it was modeled, the system of autocephalous churches has failed to meet the demands made on it in our tragic century. Yet there is no consensus on alternatives. While the Patriarch of Constantinople is acknowledged by all as first among equals, what this priority involves in the actual life of the Orthodox churches in our day is by no means clear. The line between legitimate primacy and, quote, neo-papalism, unquote, has not been drawn. The result has been a series of confrontations. What is the status of the Church of Poland, the Church of Czechoslovakia, the Paris Exarchate, the Orthodox Church in America? And what is the status of the so-called diaspora in general, and who is to determine these matters? End of quote of Erickson. A few decades ago, when people would express their shock and horror at the divisions among the Orthodox in the countries of our recent immigration, we were often told that it was all a trauma of the diaspora, that eventually the Orthodox churches in the traditional homelands would agree on a proper canonical solution to this problem, and that only the communist control of the Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe was delaying that agreement. After all, we were reminded there are no multiple jurisdictions in Orthodox countries. The communists are no longer governing the Orthodox countries, but instead of the local Orthodox churches in the Orthodox countries, now able to act in freedom, moving forward towards the long-promised resolution of the canonical situation of the Orthodox in the diaspora, the problems of the diaspora are coming home to roost in the traditional Orthodox countries. There are two competing Orthodox patriarchs in Bulgaria. There are 3 or 4 competing Orthodox jurisdictions, including 2 patriarchs in Ukraine. There is an unrecognized autocephalous church in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. There are splits over the calendar in Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania, and in Russia, there are shifting groups of hierarchs opposed to the Moscow Patriarchate. In 1992, almost on the eve of his death, Father John Meindorf wrote that, quote, there has been no real improvement in the internal problems of the Orthodox world. It is obvious, therefore, that Orthodox theologians should not limit their study of scriptures and the early church to a negative critique of Roman ecclesiology. The unity of each local church, the unity in faith and discipline between local churches, both on the regional and universal level, are what they teach as expressions of true ecclesial communion. All forms of primacy are justifiable only as instruments to secure such communion. What permanent principles and positive models shall the contemporary Orthodox Church follow, and are they to be found in the person of the Apostle Peter? How is one to approach the problem of apostolic succession? Father John goes on, quote, a wise Italian Roman Catholic layman has recently made a relevant call to avoid, quote, ecumenical triumphalism, which wavers between steps so little as to resemble immobility, and such great and definite targets as to change themselves into a utopia, Rome and Orthodoxy. Whether or not they practical Triumphalism, Unitism unavoidably define their ecclesiological positions and even their internal problems within the framework of the same scriptures and the same history of the first Christian millennium. This is the true meaning of the assertion that they are indeed sister churches. End of long quote. In August 1993, Metropolitan John Zizilis of Pergamon, an Orthodox theologian of outstanding erudition, had this to say, quote, "In an ecclesiology of communion, neither synodality nor primacy can be understood as implying structures or ministries standing above the ecclesial community or communities. Only by a structure or a ministry that would involve the community of each local church can synodality and primacy be realities of communion." He goes on. The model offered to us by the early church with regard to the synodal structure can be extremely helpful. If we do not wish to copy it, we might at least seek inspiration from it. The substance of the model is to be found in Canon 34 of the so-called apostolic canons, belonging probably to the 4th century, which provides that in each region, the heads of the local churches, the bishops, must recognize one of them, the bishop of the capital city, is primus or protos, and do nothing without him. The latter, however, must do nothing without these bishops, so that, the canon concludes, the triune God may be glorified. He goes on. The importance of this model lies in the fact that through it, synodality and primacy are affirmed in such a way that the fullness and Catholicity of each local church, expressed through its bishop, is fully safeguarded. Could this not serve as a guide for the divided Christians in their way to visible unity? Without synodality, unity risks being sacrificed in favor of the local church. But a synodality which suppresses the Catholicity and integrity of the local church can lead to ecclesiastical universalism. The same must be said about primacy. Can there be unity of the church without primacy on the local, the regional, and the universal level, and in an ecclesiology of communion? We believe not, for it is through a head, some kind of primus, that the many, be it individual Christians or local churches, can speak with one voice. But a primus must be part of a community, not a self-identified or self-defined, but a truly relational ministry. Such a ministry can only act together with the heads of the rest of the local churches whose consensus it would express. A primacy of this kind is both desirable and harmless in an ecclesiology of communion. End of long quote. A great shock came in 1995 when Moscow broke communion with Constantinople over a dispute about the small Orthodox community in Estonia. Unbelievably, the Patriarchate of Moscow, with the largest number of faithful among the Eastern Orthodox churches, both broke communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, first in honor among the Eastern Orthodox churches. The visible cause of this breach was the question of the Estonian community. The real reason was Moscow's desire to hold the primacy in the Orthodox world. The Orthodox world was shocked and horrified and demanded that the belligerents should make peace at almost any price. So it was. Moscow and Constantinople agreed to disagree about Estonia, agreeing in writing that each parish and each clergyman in Estonia could decide separately whether to belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate or the Moscow Patriarchate, and that each patriarchate could maintain a diocesan bishop in Estonia. The Holy Fathers of the first millennium of the history of the Church must be aghast, even in the heavenly kingdom, at the effrontery of suggesting that such a solution, reminiscent of sawing the baby in half, can be considered orthodox. On the basis of this cobbled together arrangement, communion was restored between Moscow and Constantinople. But the fact that the breach occurred in 1995 makes it possible to think that there is a serious danger that such a breach will occur again. One of my respected colleagues, Bishop Kallistos of Dioclea, a hierarch of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Spalding lecturer in Eastern Orthodox Studies at Oxford University, is one of the best known Orthodox theologians in the world. He was deeply shaken by the breach between Constantinople and Moscow. Bishop Kallistos has written that this terrible event must cause the Orthodox to reconsider our attitude to the Roman primacy. With that thought, I am in complete agreement. The Church needs the Roman primacy. So, what about the primacy? How would I propose to respond to Pope John Paul II's invitation to suggest how the Roman primacy may best be exercised to be received as a blessing instead of a stumbling block? What specifically might I have to say from an Eastern Orthodox position? Since 1987, I have been actively involved in the Catholic Orthodox theological dialogue here in the United States. And since 1992, I have participated in a bilateral dialogue between the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Both of these dialogues have occasioned lengthy, thorough discussions of the issues surrounding the Roman primacy and have required me to engage in extensive reading on the subject. Tentatively, at least, I may have some thoughts to offer, though this cannot and will not be an exhaustive treatment on the subject. First, let me be clear. I am not suggesting that Eastern Orthodoxy could possibly accept the manner in which the Roman primacy currently functions. And specifically, we certainly cannot and will not accept the manner in which the Roman primacy currently functions vis-a-vis the Eastern Catholic churches, as set forth in John Paul II's Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, as one could discuss with regard to any number of practical matters. That certainly will not do. Instead, let me quote again my colleague, Bishop Kallistos of Dioclea. Quote, instead of saying what Orthodox will not accept, let us ask in positive terms what the nature of papal primacy is from an Orthodox viewpoint. Surely we Orthodox should be willing to assign to the Pope in a reunited Christendom, not just an honorary seniority, but an all-embracing apostolic care. We should be willing to assign to him the right, not only to accept appeals from the whole Christian world, but even to take the initiative in seeking ways of healing when crises and conflict arise anywhere among Christians. We envision that on such occasions the Pope would act, not in isolation, but always in close cooperation with his brother bishops. We would wish to see his ministries spelled out in pastoral rather than juridical terms. He would encourage rather than compel, consult rather than coerce. End of long quote. Among both Orthodox and Catholics, there is a general agreement that so far as the Roman primacy is concerned, the first millennium is normative, and more specifically, the period from the 4th century to the 11th century. Thus, Joseph Ratzinger has stated that, quote, Rome must not require more from the East with respect to the doctrine of the primacy than had been formulated and was lived in the first millennium. The Orthodox, end of quote. The Orthodox must be prepared to acknowledge in the Bishop of Rome that primacy which he had during the first millennium, and Rome may not demand of us that we acknowledge some fundamental sort of authority that the Bishop of Rome did not have during the first millennium. To quote Bishop Callistos again, quote, "We Orthodox need to take much more seriously the evidence for the Roman primacy during the first millennium of church history. The question to be asked is, does the church need primacy? For it is surely evident that the church does. We should rather be asking, what kind of primacy does the church need? It is not the basic fact, but the precise nature of it that we have to explore together." End quote. Our decisive criterion is surely the faith and practice of the church during the first 10 centuries, when the Latin West and the Greek East were in full communion with each other. Whatever rights and powers within the Eastern Patriarchates the Pope possessed then, we Orthodox should be willing to ascribe to him now. On the Orthodox side, we cannot justly give him less than what he received when we were fully in communion, but he cannot justly ask for more. In addition, we must all be prepared to learn some hard lessons from the second millennium. I've already suggested, I think, that the Orthodox must learn that the attempt to construct an ecclesiology and to function in practice without the Roman primacy leads either to an unacceptable dependence on a secular authority, even an anti-Christian secular authority, or to an intolerable chaos. Painful though it is, we need the primacy. But there are also lessons for Rome. The second millennium was scarcely begun before Rome began trying to construct an alternate ecclesiology, ignoring the patriarchates of the East and the rights of the local churches, and centralizing ever more and more authority in Rome. Primacy of honor or primacy of jurisdiction? The Roman primacy would be worthless if it were a mere primacy of honor in the sense of an empty title. As John Paul II correctly teaches, with the power and the authority without which such an office would be illusory, the Bishop of Rome must ensure the communion of all the churches. For this reason, he is the first servant of unity. But at the end of the day, a Roman primacy which sees the Bishop of Rome as the only person in the church who has any rights is equally worthless, end quote. A prominent Roman Catholic theologian in Canada has written that primacy has to be seen not in terms of power, but in terms of service, a service which is impossible without the possession of a kind of power analogous to the one the bishop possesses to exercise his office. Exactly as episcopacy cannot be defined in terms of power, primacy cannot be defined in terms of jurisdiction. It is thus possible to discuss the problem of primacy without being entirely obsessed by the question of jurisdiction. It is also possible to challenge the way primacy is concretely exercised in the Catholic Church without affirming that primacy, as such, is against the oikonomia of the Holy Spirit. In France, the National Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church has published a series of studies on the Roman primacy in the communion of the churches. On the issue of honor and authority, our French colleagues have cogently observed that, quote, regardless of what form one employs to designate the primatial charge, the honor which recognized therein implies real authority and absolute and responsibility. Surely the primate is inter pares, but nevertheless he is truly primus. If this responsibility and this power should be regulated canonically, they should never be detached from the communion among the churches and among the bishops, which is the basis of the raison d'etre of primacy and its responsibility. Canonical legislation should never be separated from the sacramental nature of the church, which legitimates and establishes this legislation. End quote. Our French colleagues have also called our attention to the 34th Apostolic Canon and commented on it. Quote, because the one holy church must be truly present in the local church, and the communion of churches must be truly built up as a communion of local churches, there must be interdependence be him who is the first and the other bishops. The formula for this interdependence is given to us by the 34th Canon of the Apostle, widely recognized by the churches in the period which we have considered, the first millennium. Quoting the canon, it behooves the bishops of every nation to know the one among them who is the premier or chief, and to recognize him as their head, and to refrain from doing anything superfluous without his advice and approval. But instead, each of them should do only whatever is necessitated by his own parish and by the territories under him. But let not even such a one do anything without the advice and consent of the approval of all. For thus there will be concord, and God will be glorified through the Lord in the Holy Spirit, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. End quote. From this, it follows that the dichotomy, primacy of honor or primacy of jurisdiction, appears in a new light. Once Rome will take the second part of this canon truly into account and define more exactly the nature and the content of her jurisdiction, and accept a differentiated exercise of that jurisdiction, depending on whether the case in point concerns the churches of the West or the universal church. And also, once the Orthodox churches will define more precisely the areas of competence coming from the primatial roles in matter to do with regional primacies and the universal primacy. The French colleague has further observed, all primatial activity, and thus in particular the primatial role of the bishop of that church, which presides in love for the communion of the sister churches, has the service of edification and the communion of the churches as its very raison d'etre. Its service is to watch over the unity of the churches in the faith and express this faith, to bear witness to their communion, and not to allow the churches to isolate themselves and to endanger the links of Catholic communion. Thus, the role of her primate does not locate him above the churches, but at the heart of their links of communion. The Roman Patriarchate and the Roman Primacy. In December 1993, I offered some points which I considered would be of help in refining the service of the Roman primacy to the church. Perhaps these points might be useful in developing a response to Ut Unum Sint. They involve a clarification of the distinct roles of the Bishop of Rome as a local patriarch, first of the Pentarchy, and the Bishop of Rome as the universal primate. Bullet 1, the establishment of a clear, credible set of boundaries to the Roman Patriarchate and agreement on those boundaries. Bullet 2, the restoration of the canonical obligation of the Patriarch of the West when he assumes his office to send his profession of faith to the other patriarchs. Bullet 3, an end to the practice of the Pope commemorating himself at the diptychs and the restoration of the authentic practice of the commemoration of the patriarchs when the Pope celebrates the Eucharist, especially on solemn occasions. Bullet 4, the resolution of the discrepancy between the assurances given to the Orthodox in ecumenical dialogue and the practical situation of the Eastern Catholics within the Roman Communion. Bullet 5, a juridical guarantee that the terms in which Rome has defined the universal primacy will not be applied to our churches. Bullet 6, a recognition that the primatial function of the Bishop of Rome vis-a-vis the universal church is not subject to habitual delegation. Each of these points should be considered in some detail. The establishment of a clear, credible set of boundaries to the Roman Patriarchate and agreement on those boundaries. Roman Catholics often do not realize that there is a Patriarchate of the West. The Roman Patriarchate is almost invisible in terms of structure. This Patriarchate has no synod and no separate curia. Apart from the Pope himself, who is Patriarch of the West, the Roman Patriarchate appears to have no officials at all. The distinction between the Bishop of Rome in his role as universal primate and the Bishop of Rome as Patriarch of the West has been almost totally obscured. But this distinction is vital if the Bishop of Rome's primatial ministry is to function properly. In 1972, Joseph Ratzinger wrote that, quote, "The Bishop of Rome holds an administrative office for the churches of Italy and of the West generally, but not for the church as a whole. For that, she has a primacy as a direction finder and as a touchstone of unity," end quote. It is also true to say that the primates of Alexandria and Antioch are regional primates, while the Bishop of Rome holds a regional primacy, and in addition, a primacy of quite a different type in relation to the church as a whole. Perhaps the strongest linchpin of papal ecclesiology in the second millennium is the reduction of the patriarchs. Father Miroslav Tatarin has written that, quote, "In their search for power to reform the church, Popes Gregory VII and Innocent III further broadened papal claims by establishing customs and practices which clearly subordinated all the bishops to the person of the Pope. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 formally introduced the term rite, R-I-T-E, to refer to non-Latin Christians, and by so doing reduced them from ecclesiastical entities or churches to mere families of liturgical tradition. Finally, with the Crusades and the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Church expressed its total disregard for the jurisdiction and rights of the East by establishing Roman so-called patriarchates in exclusively Byzantine sees, most important of which were Constantinople and Jerusalem. It is crucial to note the term so-called patriarchates, since they were patriarchates in name only and neither had the traditional authority of Eastern patriarchs nor an actual local church over which to preside," end quote. These quote-unquote Latin patriarchates, whose titular patriarchs became decorative appendages at the papal court, are the example which papal canon lawyers use to illustrate how patriarchs ought to relate to the Pope. This reduction in the Western understanding of the ministry of genuine, authentic patriarchs in the universal church has had grave consequences. The popes of the second millennium have assumed that their patriarchal authority in the West should be extended over the Eastern churches. To illustrate by reductio ad absurdum what this means, consider a possibility. As everyone knows, the Pope is Bishop of Rome. Imagine the results if the Pope were to take it for granted that throughout the world, he should act as the diocesan bishop, appointing parish priests, deciding on the erection or suppression of deaneries, writing the diocesan statutes, approving the curricula of the schools, etc. The episcopate of the world would never put up with that. Mutantis mutandis. That is what the popes of the second millennium have tried to do to the Eastern patriarchates. In any discussion of the distinction between the Pope and the Patriarch of the West, there must be a clear definition of the territory of the Roman Patriarch and some indication of the basis of his claim to that territory. Acknowledging the primatial role of the Church of Rome in the Universal Church does not mean that we must all join the Diocese of Rome, nor that that Diocese of Rome should suddenly have elastic frontiers. Neither does it mean that we must all join the Roman Patriarchate. According to John Paul II's Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, only the quote-unquote Roman Pontiff can determine the quote-unquote territory of patriarchates. But no such law or tradition can be found in the first millennium. If it had existed, Greece would be part of the Roman Patriarchate today. There can be no justification for making this matter the exclusive competence of the Pope. The practical result is the unending aggrandizement of the Roman Patriarchate at everyone else's expense. The traditional title of the Patriarch of Alexandria is Pope and Patriarch of Alexandria and all Africa. One would expect at least a nominal recognition of the Eastern Catholic Patriarch of Alexandria as preeminent in the ecclesiastical affairs of Catholics on that continent. Most African Catholics are probably unaware of even the existence of such a person. At an ecumenical conference in Milan in September 1993, I had the pleasure of meeting the Coptic Catholic Patriarch, and it was obvious at that meeting that the Catholic bishops from sub-Saharan Africa took no notice of this patriarch. For a real distinction between the primatial role of the Pope in the Universal Church and the Pope's function as Patriarch of the West, there must be a clear, credible set of boundaries to the Roman Patriarchate. Those boundaries should be established on the criteria of their first millennium. In this connection, there is the issue of the growth of the church into the lands where she was not present during the first millennium. It is not self-evident that Alaska, Tierra del Fuego, and China all belong to the Roman Patriarchate, nor is it self-evident that extensions of the Roman Patriarchate into the Western Hemisphere should be perceived to be immediately on their own territory, while extensions of the Eastern churches should be somehow exceptions to the rule. Neither Orthodoxy nor Roman Catholicism has succeeded in finding a solution to the problems of extensions of the apostolic churches encountering one another in the same lands in the West. But we must continue to search for a solution, which eventually can only take the form of encouraging the appearance of authentic local churches in these new lands, while providing for the ongoing relationships with the mother churches for as long as the faithful shall want them. The Second Vatican Council provides that, quote, the Holy Ecumenical Council wishes, where there is need, new patriarchates to be set up. More than 30 years later, the papacy continues to show no interest in the erection of new patriarchates, and neither the 1983 Code of Canon Law of the Latin Church or the 1990 Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches provide for any procedure leading to the erection of new patriarchates. Squaring the circle. The church is not static or rigid. The church is a dynamic, lively movement, the movement of God towards his people and the movement of the pilgrim people of God here in our earthly exile towards our true home, the kingdom of heaven. In the life of every Christian and every Christian community headed by its bishop, the church is the movement of those who seek with hope to share in the most dynamic movement of all, the eternal life of the holy and life-giving Trinity, one in essence and undivided. When our Orthodox liturgical poetry seeks to portray the life of the angels and saints in heaven, the Church sometimes uses the image of the dance. The angels dance eternally, and the saints join them in this timeless choreography. Heaven itself is not at all static or rigid. This image of the dance, of sacred choreography, has important ecclesiological implications, and perhaps the most creative is with regard to the question of primacy and equality among the bishops. As our colleagues in France have observed, a dialectic tension among the many local poles and centers of agreement, among whom one is the first, can be sensed in the midst of the one hierarchical ministry and the various levels of the life of the Church. These poles cannot be absorbed, some into others, because they do not derive from each other. End quote. This dialectic tension is not in itself a fault. In dogmatic theology, we find such tension in such fundamental doctrines as the recognition of the three persons in one God, or the recognition of two natures in the one person of Jesus Christ. The need for juridical guarantees, which I mentioned above, is a real need. Indeed, it is a crucial need. But there is also a need for trust, for forgiveness, for an Orthodox willingness to recognize that we need the Roman primacy, perhaps now more than in previous periods of our history, and that ultimately our confidence must not be in juridical guarantees nor in promises, but in God Himself. There will never be a perfect juridical system which cannot be abused. Popes, patriarchs, bishops, canonists, theologians, monastics, priests, deacons, lay people are all sinners and are all capable of greed, of hunger for power, of ambition, of lack of love. We must and we shall do our best to take human sinfulness into account, but eventually we must love and trust with that special sort of Christian commitment which is able to love and trust again, even after we may feel that our love and trust have been betrayed. Thus I look for a generous Orthodox response to Ut Unum Sint. The Orthodox are not going to give away the store. We have a good deal to say about the ideology of the Roman primacy and the way in which it has been exercised. John Paul II states in the encyclical that the Roman primacy will not renounce what is essential to its ministry, and he claims the power and the authority without which such an office would be illusory. He also reminds us several times of the passages in the New Testament which Roman controversialists of the second millennium would like to interpret as referring exclusively to St. Peter and exclusively to the Pope. John Paul II is clearly a man of high intelligence and understanding. He knows full well that he cannot invite the Orthodox to the discussion and dialogue which he wants, and expect the Orthodox to allow him to decide unilaterally precisely what is essential to the mission of the Roman primacy and exactly what his power and authority must be. And he is aware that the Holy Fathers of the Church offer a broader understanding of those New Testament passages. Once the conversation begins, these matters will be thoroughly discussed and sifted. We shall not reenact the Council of Lyons, where the emperor was forced to sign his acceptance of the papal claims before the hierarchs had even assembled. But there is no need to fear that we would emerge from such a conversation with the Roman primacy in tatters. On the contrary, the Roman primacy is and should be a gift of God to His Church, a service to the Church which we all need. Thank you.